You know you can't always trust what you hear on television.
I guess it was the biggest electoral college win since Ronald Reagan.
The president is not letting this one go.
Under the Obama plan, you could separate children. They never did anything about that. Nobody talks about that. But under President Obama, they separated children from the parents.
He is still insisting that Alabama was in Dorian's danger zone, even though the National Weather Service publicly contradicted him on that.
We've accomplished an economic turnaround of historic proportions.
I'm not trying to play a political card, but if there's any reason to value post-publication peer review, this is it.
There will be no lies.
Those are just some of the lies Donald Trump has told in the first...
And I'm not picking on Trump here. Everybody's made poor choices or propagated false claims.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes.
You have to question what you hear from your political leaders.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
And for that matter, you have to be suspicious of even the scientific evidence that you come across in what's traditionally the critically appraised and the peer-reviewed literature. Because even that can be tainted. Welcome back to BrainWaves, a podcast about neurology and medicine and all the fascinating science and history that come with it, including the pseudoscience, the fake news, and the misdirection that we come across every day in the scientific literature. I'm your host, Jim Siegler, and this week on the program, we're building on our recent episode on the paradoxical problems facing patients and medical providers once a drug is approved by the FDA. It's not over yet. And this week, we'll be discussing one particular problem that we face all the time about the publication of clinical and scientific research. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's high-quality research, and it doesn't mean that you should always use it to change your clinical practice. Stay with us. Before we even get started on our own review of peer review, let's just set the basic groundwork. How does traditional peer review work? You do a study, right? You write it up, you submit it to a journal. The handling editor receives the paper, usually after a non-medically oriented staff member screens the paper to make sure it meets the specific journal requirements, title page characteristics, formatting, word count, etc. Once the handling editor gets it, maybe they read the paper, or maybe just the abstract. And if they think that the study is not of reasonable quality, immediate rejection. Otherwise, they distribute the paper to one or more reviewers. The reviewers provide feedback, often with a recommendation to accept the paper, accept it with modifications, or reject it. Then the handling editor carries out the sentencing. But let's spend a bit more time on the traditional peer review process and the reviewers. Who they are, what are their incentives, and why at all are they volunteering for this thankless task? Looking at the data, on average, academics who review papers will give their feedback on 8 or more manuscripts a year, some more, some less. And according to at least one survey, the average time spent reviewing a paper is about 5 hours. Personally, I think that's a very long time, and dedicating basically an entire work week of your year to the peer review process is a lot. Myself, I probably review 10 or 12 papers a year, and I typically spend no more than 1 to 2 hours on those papers. And that's also about the consensus of my colleagues as well. Handling editors, the people who screen the paper and outsource this critical feedback, they're responsible for reviewing 50 papers a year. In thinking about who these reviewers are, you might imagine that your paper's reviewer would be knowledgeable about your topic. They might be an expert in the field, somebody who knows what you're writing about, who recognizes the importance of your work. This is usually the case, but it does not have to be. Just the other day, for example, I was asked to review a paper on optical coherence tomography angiography in stroke imaging. Now, this was the first time I'd been asked to review a paper for this particular journal, and it was a very respectable journal, so I really wanted to honor the review request. Get in with the handling editor's good graces. Somehow, the handling editor identified me as a potential reviewer based on work I'd published on angiographic imaging in patients with carotid stenosis. But do I know anything about OCT angiography? No way. So I declined the invitation to review the paper. But let's say that I did know something about OCT angiography. Let's say maybe I was publishing a lot in that field, and I'm collaborating with many other big names in OCT angiography, I know what I'm doing, I could be completely supportive of the peer review process, completely honorable, give a really honest and useful review, help the investigator get their work published, More than 90% of reviewers claim that they review papers for this reason. They review because they enjoy contributing to the scientific community, because someone's going to be reviewing their papers. But maybe I choose to review the paper because I want more out of this task. Maybe I review papers because I think that the journal is going to provide me with the free subscription, which is what 50% of academics report wanting out of the process. Or maybe I'm a high-strung type A academic who is shooting for tenure. Maybe I've got a grant or a few grants that I need to support my salary, and my faculty position is entirely dependent on me keeping up with these grants and publishing more research. Let's say that I'm that guy who gets this paper. I could say to myself, so Christy in my lab is trying to publish work on a similar topic, and I think that she's doing a pretty good job. Maybe she should consider adding this paper's analysis to her manuscript. So maybe I do this. Maybe I completely trash the paper, I tear it apart, recommend a harsh rejection. Yet at the same time, I'm stonewalling. I sit on it. Give my postdoc or my research fellow some time to quickly wrap up her project. And then she submits her paper elsewhere, sniping that publication. Maybe I do that instead. More publications for me, more grant support, tenured faculty track, it all works out for me. A conflict of interest is not a contraindication to peer review. Or do I take the noble route instead? Decline the review. In almost all circumstances, peer review is a single blind process. The investigator's identity is known to the reviewer, but the reviewer's identity is shielded. In some cases, maybe 20% of the time, the review is double-blinded, meaning the reviewer does not know the identities of the investigators. In either case, the reviewer can provide as much feedback, positive or negative, behind a veil of secrecy and without any fear of repercussion. But let me ask you, is that a good thing? Well, turns out we've asked this question before. According to one systematic review that was published in JAMA in 2002, a paper that was peer-reviewed itself, 9 randomized controlled studies had been performed which assessed the impact of blinding or masking reviewer information on the review process. The question asked was, did masking of reviewers lead to quicker reviews or better quality reviews, tone of the reviews, and so on? I can't say that I'm at all surprised at the results. Of the 9 studies that were assessed, 5 were considered to be of high-quality methodology, and altogether, there was no effect of the review by masking the reviewer identities. The remaining 4 lower-quality papers generally showed a neutral or a small positive effect with masked reviewers, but the flaws in these studies made it hard for the authors to draw any conclusions from those publications. Not to mention, there is an inherently strong publication bias in this regard. What journal would want to waste valuable publication time and space on papers that showed no association between the blinding of reviewers and the quality of a review? While that JAMA paper from 2002 and an associated Cochrane review published by the same investigators showed generally no favorable or unfavorable effects of a blinded peer review process, some would say that traditional peer review may allow for much more negative or disparaging feedback, and maybe disclosing the identity of the reviewer to the investigators would soften the review, or it could lead to a more constructive commentary, make the article better. Maybe, if we remove that secrecy veil, a reviewer will be less condemning and more supportive. Unfortunately, by and large, reviewers generally oppose the release of their own information. According to survey data, half of reviewers report that they'd be less likely to review the paper if they knew that their identity would be revealed to the investigators. Also worth knowing about who these reviewers are is that they're not often selected at random, or they may not be selected by the handling editor at all. Probably because of the high number of manuscripts being submitted to any journal at any time, reviewers can be hard to come by. So, many journals will ask the authors to recommend reviewers on their own for their manuscript. In an ideal world, if an author gets to recommend a reviewer for their paper, the author would select an unbiased colleague who also works in their field, an expert. But that person should have no conflicts of interest with the author's work. And let me tell you, this is nearly impossible. In my own experience, basically anybody that I've ever worked with, I'm pretty sure that I'm on good terms with. I hope so, at least. And on some level, I'm sure they may just feel only a little guilty if they recommend against publishing my paper, knowing I was the author. Alternatively, these colleagues of mine, my friends, maybe they're also trying to publish more related research. Maybe they have a very similar paper to mine that's almost ready for submitting. Maybe they're even considering submitting that paper to the very same journal. How do you think they'd review my paper then? So that's how the peer review process works. Let's now consider the advantages and the disadvantages. First, I'll say that peer review is still really in its infancy. Historically, peer review was probably first used in patient notations by a Syrian physician, Ishaq bin al-Rahawi, in the early 9th century CE. Then the traditional peer review process for published medical works came about probably in the early 18th century with the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Medical Essays and Observations, 1731. And at that time, peer review was really just an editorial process, grammar, syntax, that sort of thing. Peer review in the form of constructive feedback, as we know today, was really only implemented in the second half of the 20th century. Second, peer review is incredibly convenient now, maybe even necessary, because of the exponential progress that's made by scientists in the past centuries, especially in the past 70 to 80 years. Peer review has afforded editors with the opportunity to filter lower quality work and also to rule out plagiarism. One argument that's made against this benefit, however, is that once a paper is rejected, it's often resubmitted to a lower quality journal. And I'm certainly guilty of that myself. If the paper is rejected again, it's resubmitted elsewhere, and so on and so forth. Eventually, even these poorer quality studies get published, in spite of our best practices and our established peer review process. But fortunately, as I'm sure you're aware, there is an academic ladder, so to speak, where more critical journals are going to publish the higher quality papers. And this provides us, as readers, with a litmus test of scientific credibility. You're going to be more likely to rely on research papers and reviews that are published in Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine than maybe you'd rely on anything that's published at all from the biomedical and anatomical pathologic proceedings of the state of New Jersey. But how reliable are these journals? And how reliable is this peer review process at improving a manuscript? Fiona Godley and her colleagues conducted a randomized trial assessing reviewers who were given a manuscript that was accepted for publication in the British Medical Journal. The paper was already accepted. It was good to go, vetted by the BMJ editorial board. But Godley's team injected 8 weaknesses of methodology, results, or interpretations to the paper. 221 reviewers provided their feedback. I don't think that any reviewer was necessarily expected to identify all the errors, but guess how many errors were identified by each reviewer on average? 2. 2 out of 8 major errors. And 16% of the reviewers didn't report a single error. They couldn't find them. So what would I take away from this kind of a study? Reviewer A identifies 2 errors, Reviewer B another 2 errors, Reviewer C 1 error, Reviewer D 5 errors. What I'm taking away from this is if you incorporate the feedback of more than just 1, 2, or 3 reviewers, you're more likely to pick up more of these flaws in the paper, increasing your sensitivity. So is there a way to solicit this amount of feedback before the paper gets published? And if so, is there a way for the author to incorporate that feedback by hundreds of reviewers? Well, I think that that's probably unreasonable. The whole process would come to a screeching halt as reviewers would burn out with the number of papers that they'd be asked to look at, and scientists would stop submitting papers for publication if they knew they were going to have to address hundreds of comments. But maybe there's a way to solicit this kind of feedback in an open forum, engage any reader who comes across the paper. So, in 2002, Biomed Central opened the publication floor for comments, and in 2008, PLOS ONE followed suit. By 2019, you can find that almost every major academic journal invites readers to comment on published work after it's gone to press. The New England Journal, Neurology, JAMA Neurology, and so on. Also, you can do this outside of these journals by writing up comments online at Retraction Watch, PubPeer, and PubMed Commons, among other sites, which I think is so important. First, it opens the dialogue up to the community of providers, not just researchers, who may have their own biases, as we said, to get the community's input. And second, it extends the conversation to other researchers who can appraise the paper for its credibility for its validity and the conclusions that we should draw from it. There may need to be some points of clarification. Why'd you exclude this patient population? Did you see the same treatment effect in this other at-risk subgroup? What did you make of this limitation? The other day, I came across a paper in Neurology which estimated the 20-year incidence rate of dementia in middle-aged adults. The authors reported an incidence rate of about 15%, a 1 in 7 chance that if you're about 40 years of age, no prior stroke, that you're going to develop dementia in the next 2 decades, which is a pretty incredible risk. But then you take a look at the subtext that's hidden at the bottom of one of the figures. Only 29% of patients followed up for clinical assessment to evaluate for dementia. The remaining 70% didn't. They were excluded. Didn't follow up. The authors don't bring this up again, and they never mention this limitation. Wouldn't you think that if you had some memory problems or some sort of neurologic complaint, that you'd be more likely to follow up and be assessed for that issue? That maybe you'd be more likely to have dementia than the 70% who stay out in the world and never come back to clinic? Seems like a monumental selection bias to me, but it's one that was not addressed in the editorial peer review process. It's only one that we're bringing up now in post-publication peer review. And whether you're bringing it up with the journal as a comment to the editor, as a separate letter to the editor, or on Retraction Watch or PubPeer or PubMed comments, wherever you're engaging in this dialogue, it's so important that we continue these conversations and we ask these questions. We demand more of our scientific researchers, especially when they're making decisions that ultimately impact our clinical decision-making. Nobody gets it right the first time, and only with this continued and ongoing discussion are we going to develop more concrete ideas and decision-making practices. So log on to Twitter, log on to Facebook, ask these questions, post some comments, see what people think, and do it responsibly. Because no matter what gets published, wherever it gets published, if you're a medical provider, you're the last stop out there. In spite of what we've covered today, let's be serious. Nobody's going to argue that we should do away with pre-publication or traditional peer review. We absolutely need to keep that initial filter in place so that our journals can screen and hopefully improve a paper before it goes to press. And I'm sure you come across a paper all the time and you think to yourself, who let that get published?
Now, I hate to tell you, Puerto Rico, but you've thrown our budget a little out of whack.
Imagine how many more times you'd be asking yourself that question if there were no initial filter in place.
We are also praying for the people of Puerto Rico. We love Puerto Rico.
But even after you have that initial filter, even after the paper gets printed, you can't be suckered into believing it just because some person gave it a stamp of approval.
I will never lie to you.
No matter how respectable the publication may be, or that speaker may be, or the editor may be, or how lousy it could be.
Your organization's terrible.
Read everything with caution and with criticism.
With fire and fury, like the world has never seen.
Because publication is not the final step in peer review. That wraps it up for another week of the BrainWaves podcast. I'd like to end the show by leaving you with the conclusions that were stated in the 2006 Cochrane Systematic Analysis of Editorial Peer Review. Quote, "At present, little empirical evidence is available to support the use of editorial peer review as a mechanism to ensure quality of biomedical research." End quote. So while we all think that peer review that's prior to manuscript publication is necessary to ensure high-quality research is circulated, it's actually you guys out there who are ultimately responsible for assessing these papers and letting these papers influence your clinical practice. In the same vein, even when you're listening to a medical podcast like BrainWaves, regardless of whatever external review occurs prior to one of the episodes that's published, or whoever could have contributed to the content of the show, none of that probably matters, to be honest. Several consensus papers came out in 2015 assessing blogs and podcasts, and they all emphasized peer review, but with absolutely zero basis. It's up to you to critically appraise whatever you read or hear. You can't always believe what you come across on the news or online, even in the Lancet. And with that, I think I'll get off my soapbox. Thanks so much for checking out our show this week. If what we discussed today was at all interesting to you, you'll probably like one of our earlier shows featuring Dr. Ali Hamadani on p-values, episode 147, or episode 122, Bias in Clinical Research. The BrainWaves podcast was produced out of Studio 3 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Jim Siegler, senior producer. Music for this week's program was courtesy of Culla, Lee Rosevere, John Bartman, Kevin MacLeod, and John Watts. Sound effects by Mike Koenig and Daniel Simeone. I'm Jim Siegler, and I'll talk to you soon.